Hi, I'm Matthew Hall. I'm the author of The Black Art of Killing. I'm a novelist and a screenwriter.
Brought to you by the Wilbur and Niso Smith Foundation, the Adventure Society is a book club for adventurous people. In each episode, we try to bridge the gap between an author and their readers, asking about everything, from their latest book, how they got where they are today, and their strangest Google research. In this episode, we talk to screenwriter and novelist Matthew Hall, author of The Black Art of Killing.
Okay, so the hero or protagonist is Leo Black. He's a guy about 50, and what we learn about him is that he was in the SAS for 20 years, where he rose to the rank of major. He joined the SAS having done a history degree at Oxford, but he went into the army. But his period in the army was one of the busiest in the history of the British Army. He went through the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, all sorts of missions across the world that the SAS have been involved with. And he was a man who was very, very good at the most violent tasks and did them sort of almost unthinkingly. And then there came a point in his life, in his mid-40s, where he could no longer do it. He didn't know quite why. And he decided to change course and to try and reinvent himself as an academic. So he goes back to university, gets a PhD, and when we meet him, he's trying to get tenure as a history fellow in Oxford University, and he's struggling because his colleagues at the university don't really trust an ex-soldier. He doesn't really fit in politically with their scheme. And then the inciting incident of the book is he gets a phone call from the wife of the sergeant he was very close to for 15 years. And she's had a call saying that he was doing a bodyguarding job over in Paris and has been killed. And will Leo go and identify his body, which he does. And soon after that, he's visited late at night by his former commanding officer, Freddie Towers, who is now doing something slightly shady for the Ministry of Defence, also having left the army. And he invites Leo, or sort of lures him into investigating the circumstance of their colleague's death. And that leads into a sort of international adventure, I suppose. I came from quite a creative family, I suppose. My dad was still is a classical musician. And my mother was a kind of writer, aspiring writer when I was young. And then my stepfather came along into my life and he was a writer. It was quite a bohemian household in many ways. I won't go into all of that, but as a teenager, I felt I had to rebel. Every teenager has to rebel. And my rebellion was to get as far away from that atmosphere as possible, as far away from creativity as possible. So I became a barrister. So I got myself to Oxford University to study law, ended up at the bar. I wanted to be a civil law barrister. I didn't want anything to do with any human interest cases, but I ended up eventually becoming a criminal barrister by a series of accidents. I was really interested in the people I was meeting, and I started wanting to write about my experiences. And I'd only been practicing for about 3 or 4 years, and I started trying to write TV scripts about a young lawyer, not surprisingly. And that kind of, one thing led to another. I studied writing really as kind of quite an academic discipline, because that was the way I was thinking at the time. And after about a year or so, I produced a script I thought was kind of good enough to show people. And eventually it led to me getting a job writing on a TV show called Kavanagh QC that was a legal show. And once I'd done an episode or two of that, I sort of stepped away from the law thinking I can always go back afterwards. But yeah, nearly 25 years have slipped by and I never did. So
you said you studied writing. Did you self-study, or did you kind of train anywhere or do any courses?
Well, like a lot of people, when I started trying to write, my writing was very linear. So it didn't have a lot of structure to it. So I was kind of struggling to create stories that were dramatically satisfying. And I didn't even fully realize that was the problem. And I started reading a few books on story structure. And then I went to seminars by a guy called Robert McKee, who's an American screenwriter. He has seminars all over the world, still does. I think that was a 4-day course. It cost me quite a lot of money at the time that I could ill afford, but it was probably the best money I've ever spent. Because over the course of 4 days, I effectively learned the rules of drama. I learned what turns the idea for a story into an actual functioning story. So it was kind of like a tool, getting hold of a toolkit, which I could then use. Some people say it's a bit formulaic, the way he approaches things. I don't think that at all. I think that there are rules of storytelling, and getting to grips with them really is what you've got to do when you start out.
And do you think a lot of those tips translate from screen to the page?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any distinction really between the medium in which you're working. The only distinction is, I mean, obviously I've spent probably most of my career, or at least half of it, working exclusively in television. Mm-hmm. And in television, every single moment on the screen has to propel the story forwards. In books, you are allowed some breathing space. But you get very used to the discipline writing for the screen of making sure that the story is just relentlessly moving and progressing. And one of the joys of writing books actually is that you have the space every now and again just to indulge in a thought. As long as the story is compelling enough, generally, you can have a little meditation on something, which is what I tend to do. You know, I like books that both deliver a really thrilling story, but that also go a little bit deeper than that. Thinking about it, I think it's got quite deep roots really, because I live in Herefordshire, on the Herefordshire-Monmouthshire border, and I went to school in Hereford, which is the home of the SAS. And some of my school friends had dads who were in it or who were just leaving it. And we also had neighbours. Yeah, I knew various people who were either in the SAS or had recently left it. And I was very intrigued by these guys, by the fact that you usually met a very mild-mannered, affable, civilized person who would then disappear for periods of a time to do goodness knows what. I now sort of have an understanding of what they were doing. And then they would come home and you'd meet this mild-mannered person again. So I got this real sense of the dual personality of these people in the special forces. And over the years, I realized that I really wanted to write about one of these characters. We used to have an ideal in our culture of a kind of warrior philosopher. The ancient Greeks had that, you know, the most rounded man was a great warrior and also a thinker. We very much had it in the Middle Ages with our knights who were meant to be learned and brave. I went to Oxford University. My oldest son has been there not long ago, and I was very aware of how the university establishment has moved a long way away from something like the realities of military engagement and the idea that the civilization which they represent has ultimately to be protected by people prepared to do violence on our behalf. And none of us want to think about that very closely, but I thought, you know, wouldn't it be interesting to have a character who is both having to do that protection for the rest of us, but who's also in the middle, the soft beating heart of our society as well. So in 2010, I remember going upstairs and scribbling some notes about a character who later became Leo Black. And originally I thought that I might pitch this character to television. And I think I might have had a few conversations with various TV executives. You go in and you sit on their sofa and you give them maybe 3 or 4 ideas. And I think I got brushed off. Oh, we've got something like that, or we don't need another sort of military story or something. Mm-hmm. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, actually, I want to go quite deep with this character, and I want to explore him in a way in which television wouldn't allow me to do. Because the first instinct of television would be to say, well, exactly what are all his redeeming features? And they would want a character who, if he was asked to do something violent, would then be suitably remorseful afterwards. And the point of this character was that he has this duality. The two sides of him don't really meet in the middle. And I thought ultimately that was going to be best expressed in prose, because what you have in prose is that ability to get inside the mind of, right inside the mind of your character, which you just don't have on the screen.
I really liked your opening, which I won't give too many spoilers, but you meet Leo and he's setting out his thoughts to a therapist when he leaves the army. And opening like that really felt like it explained some of his experiences and his beliefs, so you know what you're getting into with him. But how do you go about writing violence, especially when it's so brutal? How do you know where to draw the line?
That's a good question. So I did a lot of talking to someone who lives not very far away from me. He was in the SAS for 15 years. He's become a friend. And I said to him, well, what's it like, you know, having to kill people? And he said, well, it's just a job. Once you wrapped your mind around that, you realize that you're dealing with a category of human being that can kill people and not suffer any mental anguish afterwards. And I interrogated him closely about that. And he's adamant that he's never lost any sleep over what he's done in the course of his job. The only time he lost any sleep was over an incident when he was a young infantryman, and he thought that he might have jumped to take cover when he should have been shielding someone who was injured. I've not written much violence ever, but I have in this book. But I very much felt that it had to be real. If I was going to go there, it would have to be real, and actually have to be a little bit disgusting as well. Because I'm very uncomfortable when I read books that glamorize violence. And my thought was, well, let's make it horrible so that the experience of reading it leaves you thinking, I could never do that. And then wondering at how anyone can do it, which is exactly what I want to achieve, because the point is that only a few people can do that. And the special forces almost, well, they succeed very well in selecting the few people alive who are capable of doing that. But also the weird thing is that they can do that, but then they can be perfectly gentle and like the rest of us. And that's the bit that's kind of, and we'll never fully understand what it's like to inhabit that sort of mind, but I wanted to be truthful about it.
Was there anything that you found particularly difficult to write?
Yeah, there's a sequence where Leo is asked to abduct two people who are thought might be spies, effectively, and he has to extract information from them. And the way in which he does it is how the SAS operated in Northern Ireland. So I read extensively about exactly what they did and how you get people to talk, and I imitated that. And Leo does not enjoy doing it. It's a job. It's particularly difficult because there's no one else there. It's just him doing this job alone. And so there's a horrible sort of intimacy about it. And that was quite difficult to write because I was constantly sort of traversing a fine line the whole time. But hopefully I judged it right.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the scientists. I just wondered where the idea of what they're working on came from.
Yeah, so the underlying idea is that you can have a mechanism for really influencing vast swathes of people. Well, that's very much a real idea that's in the world at the moment. It's what the big internet companies are doing. It's a sort of commercial fantasy of Amazon and Google. So it's very much a live idea. The specific science in this story involves nanoparticles, which can be delivered to very specific parts of the human brain. And at the moment, nanoparticles are very much in their infancy, but they're being developed, and they're being developed for use in the brain. One of the technological problems is how you deliver them to a very specific part of the brain. And I started researching this, and to my great surprise, I found that people were actually creating very sophisticated mechanisms for delivering little particles actually to any cell in the body, you know. So it's driven by a desire, for example, to be able to get to a brain tumor deep in the brain. So without having to cut through the brain, you deliver some nanoparticles there, and then they heat up and destroy the tumor. So all the science is absolutely real. What I did was sort of bring several disciplines together.
You take us on this amazing journey that Leo is undertaking, and that's a physical journey. We see him go from London to Paris. He's in Oxford, the Welsh border. He's in Venezuela, and you've talked a little bit about your background and where you're from. So I know you know some of these places, but do you know all of them? And do you have any tips kind of for researching places and writing locations?
Well, obviously I know the Welsh borders very well because it's where I've lived much of my life. And London I lived for 15 years, and so I know that very well. Oxford I know well. Paris I know to a certain extent. Copenhagen I visited and enjoyed, so that features. Venezuela I haven't been to. I've been to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro, which is basically the closest I could get to a sort of simulation of what Venezuela is like at the moment. And I met a bunch of Venezuelans, bizarrely in Aberdeen, because there's a big connection in the oil industry. There's a lot of Venezuelans in Aberdeen. Anyway, but that sense, very much the sense of grinding poverty next to wealth and danger, and people driving around with guns and not knowing whether you might be snatched off the street, is something you very much get in Rio de Janeiro. It looks beautiful, but then they've got bodies washing up on the beach and stuff. So it's, I wish I'd been able to get to Caracas, but it wasn't possible at the moment, not safely, not responsibly. But what you can do, of course, is then with the internet, you can research very, very, in a very detailed way. And I do, down to street view of every single place that I'm going, or any interior. I want to know exactly where I am. And I just think that level of detail is just hugely important. And you kind of owe it to the readers to get everything absolutely right. And the more ability we have to research in detail, the more it obligates you to do that, I think. You can't really make anything up. But the adventure part of it was, really quite thrilling. I've always wanted to. I've written a few adventures in for the screen, but not like that. And of course, in a book, you've got that possibility to do a really big sweep. You can go anywhere and do anything.
And I wanted to ask what the strangest thing is that you had to Google for this book, or if there's anything that springs to mind.
Wow, for this book, I don't know. There was all sorts of crazy scientific stuff I was looking at, and looking up different types of weapon and how to blow up helicopters. That was, I was looking at Semtex, where you get hold of it, how you detonate it. So yeah, that probably would have been quite a good trail. I've admired a lot of American prose writers. So there's a crime writer who's died a few years ago called Elmore Leonard, who terrific crime writer, and what he did was write stories in really sort of pared down prose, and he got straight to the essence of what was going on in the story and led you straight there. And his prose was like poetry, and I really admired that. I've admired writers like John Grisham because he's just an excellent storyteller, and the moment you open one of his books, he sort of beds you down into the narrative in the first few pages, and it's very comforting, and you know you're going to get a good story that resolves well. But I'm also quite a fan of, you know, fairly literary fiction as well. So I know John le Carré, I suppose, is at the literary end of the thriller genre, and I've enjoyed all his books.
Do you think you've had any adventurous experiences in your life that maybe have influenced you as a writer?
Well, just, you know, I mean, plenty of emotional experiences, but in terms of physical adventures, well, there's a couple of things that stand out. I had a good friend who was working in Moscow in '94, and so I had a chance to visit Moscow in the winter of 1994, which was very interesting because it was kind of like the Wild West at the time. Capitalism was just taking over, and it was just crazy to see a society in a real state of flux. So there would be like an illegal money exchange on every corner, but there would be these armed militia outside with machine guns, you know, just security guards in camouflage with a machine gun. And if you wanted to go anywhere, you just stuck I did this with my friend, I wouldn't do it alone. You stuck your thumb out, any old car would stop, tell them where you want to go, and pay them a few rubles. And mostly it was, you know, school teachers, academics, anyone wealthy enough to have a car would just give you a ride around. So all of that was going on. And all the big Soviet parks on the edge of town had been turned into sort of giant flea markets and places where they were selling thousands of stolen secondhand cars from Germany, and it was kind of crazy. I think I always say the most important thing is you've got to ask yourself, what have I got to say? Because a story is nothing more or less than a means of communicating something that you have to say to the world. So if you're just conjuring a story for the sake of telling a story, it's not going to work. You have to have a higher purpose to it. So I think I'll begin with that. And the second thing is that your central character is always the most important thing about any story. And I've absolutely convinced of that. You know, I started out thinking that story structure was everything, and story structure is part of it, but that doesn't work unless you've got a character who is actually the essence of the characters, they've got to be conflicted on some inner level. So if you've got a character that's got some deep level of internal conflict going on, that is going to be dramatized in the course of your stories, they're going to be pulled in directions they don't want to go, that's going to make for an exciting story. One more tip, the other tip, this is what I did when I was starting writing. Just watch your favorite TV dramas and watch a scene at a time and write down what happened in every scene. Stop, start for a few episodes, and then look back at your notes and just see how the story progressed. It's a really good way of learning how dramatic tension is built up. And read the books on the story. The good storytelling books tend to be about screenwriting. I don't know why. I mean, Stephen King wrote his book on writing, which is good, but there are some really terrific books on screenwriting which are wholly applicable to novel writing, particularly in the thriller and adventure genre. So Robert McKee's book Story is brilliant. Write stories in the way that you think about the world. If you're you know, quite an educated, well-read, learned person, then you're necessarily going to write in a voice that's more like that. So you've got to be as authentic as you can. And so I gave up trying to be anything that I thought I ought to be with this book. And I thought, well, I'll just see what my natural voice is like. And that's what came out. So I wait and see if it works or not.